just start playing. Just play, don't worry about it. And I just thought, you know, I remember reading about that some years back when I was reading about the history of punk rock, and that's so contrary to what bands today in mainstream music tell you. Oh, you got to practice, practice, practice. You got to do this, and you have to hone your craft. You got to pay your dues. Ramon said, "Fuck that. Go out and play." And that started the Clash. Really got them going. And out of that came, you know, again when he was Joe Strummer, he was living in an area where Rastafarian Jamaican blacks. Now England was really riddled with racism, and you know, the violence against blacks was just seemed to have been out of control. He grew up in an area in a Jamaican blacks, and he saw the black man fighting back. And then he saw the white man blaming everyone else for his problems except really looking at the true enemy. And then when the band was being formed and they were writing songs, of course, came White Riot. You need to check the lyrics out of White Riot. You know, and I mean, you take like what today's going on, you see the social upheaval of today, riots breaking out. We see the black man rioting, and much more a bigger organized issue today than what it was back then, but they're doing it. You see what happened in DC a couple weeks ago. People have their opinions of that. But what did he say? White man, need to riot. Read the lyrics to White Riot. Because people are only going to bring change when they do have to show forms of violence. You need to react and speak against this oppression. And we've seen this really big time in England. The songs really spoken and inspired the people. And so how this came a movement of young people that were really excited about what was going on. And they were pissed off. They were tired of being told and being held back and being oppressed. They couldn't even play their instruments, but they did it. They took what they knew and they built upon that. Like, for instance, the Sex Pistols, when they first started, a lot of people don't know the Sex Pistols did cover tunes. When they first started, they played cover songs. You know, all you do is look at the early songs that the Pistols recorded, a lot of their early demos and bootlegs. They were demos and of cover songs that they did. Except Johnny Rotten would take the lyrics and he would twist them and distort the lyrics and make them very negative and cynical. Make the lyrics his. And then, of course, Matlock started writing his own music, and then Rotten would start putting the lyrics to it. And then you had a pretty goddamn good team of songwriting right there with Matlock and Rotten. And how that came, Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen, and you know, they started writing their own songs. So, but going back to the Ramones, and when they came to New York and the fire that they set in that country and the reaction, because you got to think the Ramones in America at best were just playing small clubs and venues. They never got the reaction from anyone as they did in England. They were like gods there. And throughout the Ramones' entire career, it was always England and Europe and Central South America, Northern Europe, where they got their fucking start. This was where they really were appreciated and loved. They were gods there. They would pack stadiums. Like in the 80s and even early 90s when they broke up, they were packing stadiums to Europe. Come to America, they were still playing in small clubs and venues. And so the Ramones never got the appreciation they really deserved in America. They were still the underground, small band, still trying to break out and make mainstream, and it just never seemed to work for them. But in other countries, especially England, they were loved. They were gods. They started a movement, and people knew who they were, and they gave them that appreciation. And I really think today they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is richly deserved on their part. But it's some today how you see how people run around with a fucking Ramones shirt. Today the Ramones is the hip thing to do. You got to have a Ramones shirt, Ramones poster, you got to have a Ramones CD. But in their time, in their biggest prime time, no one gave a fuck about them here in America, except for the underground. But the mainstream, because that's the thing in America, we're fickle. We're very fickle about our music, about our pop culture. And so then you had the Damned, of course, come up. You had the Damned was influenced by that, and of course they had more of a dark gothic horror feel to it. And I think one of the Damned's favorite songs of mine was A New Rose. I really like that song. Never a huge Damned fan, but I had to give them credit. And the biggest part about all that in the 70s, a lot of those 70s punk bands like Blondie, she definitely had her roots at CBGB's and the early punk movement. They played shows with the Ramones, and you know, and of course television, and we don't even talk about the Talking Heads. Most of those bands eventually, of course, as the era was changing, as the 70s was ending and the 80s was rolling in, you know, a lot of those bands found mainstream acceptance. MTV was being born, a form of musical expression in the form of music videos. Or if you couldn't go see a band live, you can catch them in a music video. I remember what the first day MTV appeared. I was like 10, 11 years old, and I was at my dad's, and MTV premiered, and then the first videos were playing out, and within a matter of a few weeks, you had The Clash on there, you had Blondie, and a lot of those CBGB bands were actually there on MTV in its premieres, in its premiere weeks. So, and also, we want to talk about the Anarchy Tour. At that time, I think like in 76, 77, there was a tour called the Anarchy Tour. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Damned, and I think Johnny Thunder and the Heartbreakers, they came over from America to England. They did a tour. At that time, of course, they did manage a few shows, but it got stopped because of the Sex Pistols, of course, were on the Bill Grundy show. Anyone who knows about punk rock knows about the infamous Bill Grundy episode and what happened there with the foul language being spoken on public TV, and the Sex Pistols immediately became public enemy #1. I want to talk about the Pistols when it comes to punk rock. Today, a lot of people think, especially in punk rock, that they were like a Backstreet Boys or a boy band of punk rock. They were just something formed by McLaren. There was nothing really real about them. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Anyone that really knows the Pistols knows the backgrounds they come from in poverty. Maybe they were put together for that purpose, but they existed in a very brief period of time, like from 76 to about 78. And in that period of time, they didn't play very many shows. They were banned. No band has ever shocked the world and caused a cultural impact and had such an influential impact the way the Pistols did. They were banned to play in their own countries. They were attacked on the streets. I think Johnny Rodney talked about where a machete, he had a machete took into his leg. He was cut up. He was beaten up. You know, at that time, the punk rockers were feuding with what they called the Teddy Boys, which is a social group, had their fashion based in 50s fashion. They were constantly being attacked by them. Skinhead movement, of course, was being born at that time. They were being attacked by the skinheads. The whole political and media of England would not allow the Pistols. They became public enemy #1. You can almost say they were the Trumps at that time. I know that ain't a popular statement, but that's the truth. They were being banned. They were being censored. Malcolm McLaren, of course, Sid Vicious at this time had already joined the band. There was an outing with Matlock, didn't work out. You can study and read into what happened there, whether if you think that was a good or bad thing, but nevertheless, Matlock was gone. The songwriting, of course, was in it at that point. They weren't writing more songs. Sid Vicious was brought into the band as the new bass player. And Sid took the image of the Pistols and took it to a whole new level. The band definitely had developed that bad boy infamous image at that point, and they couldn't play anywhere. So McLaren ended up scheduling a tour of the Scandinavian countries. It was known as the Spots Tour. Sex Pistols on tour. That's what the Spots represented. So he took them up into Northern Europe, up in the Scandinavian lands, and they played some of their best shows ever. The band had to get away out of their country of England and go into places, because at that time, a lot of like Sweden and them, a lot of them countries were under strike. Their firemen were on strike. The people were unemployed. The kids were upset. They had nothing. And so the Pistols come along, and they actually played shows for little kids At that time there, I think it was in Christmas of '77, the Sex Pistols played on this Scandinavian tour Christmas show, one for the kids where they kind of toned down the language, kept it a little bit more ground level, more appropriately for kids, and they gave away toys and fashion, Sex Pistols merch, and they played a show for the kids. They had cake and treats for them, and they did something for the kids. And there's actually a documentary on YouTube you can watch where they really go into detail, and they talked about how much fun they loved doing that, how the kids got them. And then they did another one, I think, that next night with the adults, and it was more of the adult theme with the language, a little more up there. So the Pistols played, and when they would come out, people didn't know who they were. They were just called the Spots. So people were out there to hear this band, then they would come out on stage, and it was the Sex Pistols. People were like fucking freaking out. It's the Sex Pistols. So I thought that was a pretty damn brilliant. I thought that was a very brilliant part on McLaren to set that up. And of course, they had in '78 the famous, infamous tour of America where they came to USA and played. There's a separate book on that. It's called 12 Days on the Road with the Sex Pistols. The bodyguard of the band wrote it. Hell of a fucking book. Their stories in there, it'll mess with your mind. Some of them stories he told. So the Pistols came to America, played, broke up at the end of that tour. They played, I think it was San Francisco, the last show, and they ended. And at that time, it was the end of an era. You can see it when the Pistols ended. The Clash was starting to move more toward mainstream music, as was Blondie. A lot of the CBGB movement was moving toward mainstream. So that early first stage of punk was starting to end. And then as that decade was ending and the 80s was coming in, a new form of punk, as the old punk was dying out, people were making the cry, punk is dead, punk is dead, punk rock's over with. The media was even foretelling. You had Sid Vicious came to America. He started a solo career. Of course, it was all sidetracked by his drugs, and then, of course, the murder of Nancy. And by the way, another side note, while we're talking on the subject of Sid Vicious, there was a band who played with him at Max's Kansas City. It was called Living Hell. Living Hell was actually the first true punk rock band. It's not the Bad Brains as everyone says it is. You can see it was the first black punk rock band. Everyone thinks Bad Brains. No, it was Living Hell. Living Hell started back in '75, '76, and they actually look like fucking badasses. If you could go online, look up Living Hell and you can see video footage. Dude, they were a fucking definition of punk rock. And they were better than a lot of the so-called punk rock bands that period. And one thing I seen there, I was actually watching a music video where they were playing, the singer was wearing a swastika shirt. The singer was actually wearing a swastika shirt. So I found that, and of course they opened and played a show or two with Sid Vicious. Everyone knew how he was famous for the swastika. Now today, and I found that so interesting, blacks, and that was, again, and they talked about in interviews, you can read interviews with Living Hell, how they talked about how they suffered discrimination, and they were, the bigotry that just ran rampant, and what they had to suffer and go through. But they still wore a swastika. They didn't feel that it was, wearing it was such a bad thing as we do today. They had swastika. If you get caught with a swastika shirt, you get fucking killed for that. And so it just goes to show you people weren't so fucking sensitive as they are today. People were so sensitive over the dumbest issues, but when you had a black punk band hanging out with an English punk rocker and both of them wearing swastikas. So I go to show. Also, of course, we want to talk about you got to talk about the Dead Boys, also part of the CBGB's movement. They were probably one of the most degenerate, vulgar, anti-establishment bands ever. The Dead Boys came from Ohio, came out to New York to play, and of course, Hilly, I think it was actually Hilly helped get them signed. He wanted to get them started and get a record deal signed with them, and he actually put a lot of his own money. Damn near went bankrupt, if I remember right, in the process of managing the band. So the Dead Boys actually are probably one of the premier 70s punk rock. In some way, they were more badass than the Pistols was. So, and I actually like I really like the Dead Boys and Stiv Bators. Matter of fact, Stiv Bators was going to do some shows with Sid Vicious, and they were actually pretty good buddies. And so anyway, punk rock was dying out. That first wave was starting to come to an end as the murder of Nancy Spungen and the breakup of the Pistols and the forming of a new era. Music was changing. And along with that, with new sounds, new music was coming along. Everything changes. Change is inevitable. So as the 1980s were starting to come in, the old punk rock was starting to die out, and a new punk rock was starting to come out. It was more darker, based even more in the streets, a little more cynical, maybe a little more heavier in fashion than what the original punk rock movement was. And we're going to call it hardcore, street punk. We'll be talking in the next volume, or I guess our next part 2, about the hardcore movement and the street punk movement. We're going to talk about bands like Discharge and the whole Anti-Cimex, the Scandinavian punk rock of the 1980s, the D-Beat, like Discharge and all them, who was also one of my favorite bands. And of course, a hardcore band such as Agnostic Front and the Straight Edge movement. What came out of that? All came from the streets, all came from the kids. It was not created or made by the media. It was created as a response to the social and political issues of the world going around them. So come in, make sure you come back, hit the subscribe to the Rick's Savage News and Reviews. Keep coming back as we have our little discussion about the history of punk rock and the underground subgenres as we continue going into the hardcore movement and cover these bands. Again, this is just a brief discussion. We're not going to be able to go into a lot of details. I know a lot of people will say, what about this band and what about this and that? We can only talk about, I'm trying to discuss the bands and the music as it's cultural, as it was a cultural phenomenon to the world and its impact. It had an influential impact on the world, the bands at that time. So keep coming back. We'll be back maybe in a few days for part 2. Again, if you can get your hands on it, Please Kill Me. The Uncensored Oral History of Punk Rock by Legs McNeil, and England's Dreamin' by John Savage. We're going to have some, matter of fact, let me see here. If you get your hands on it, right here, Burning Britain, the History of Punk, 1980 1984. Pretty much our next part's going to be on these subjects right here, on these kind of bands. How this was wave 2 of the punk rock movement in England, and how the hardcore punk movement was for America. So this is the Rick signing out. Sure to come back for part 2. And keep in mind, as we talk about the social issues of that period and how very similar it is today. Because it takes those things to create music, and there needs to be a reaction. Every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. And I think we're seeing something ready to build up. I think we're going to see new bands that's going to be wanting to play, that's going to be inspired of the political and social issues that's going around them. I mean, I hate to say it, but today it seems like bands today are more concerned just holding ground, hoping and praying for the day to come where COVID's going to go away and all this shit's going to calm down and they can start playing again. And right now we're focused more on the bands selling their merch and just trying to keep their heads above water and survive. I think that's bad. I think that's really bad. That was what the bands before that reform was caring about. And I don't think today, as there's bands out there getting ready to form, that's seeing what's going on around them, is going to give a fuck about that kind of shit. I think they're going to care about the music. They got something to say. And they're going to be inspired about the social and political issues that's going on. The 70s is happening already again, except we just got the cell phones and better technology. But it's still the same beast, still the same monster, and it's getting ready to rear its ugly head. Come back for part 2. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on the Rick's YouTube. Rick's out.